The Flaxborough Flower and Produce Show was an annual occasion more solemnly observed than Easter, and approached with considerably greater competitiveness. The weather had been, for once, obliging. A thin sunlight slanted across the municipal field, illuminating the serried ranks of dahlias and chrysanthemums set out beneath the marquee as though awaiting judgment by a court of horticultural law. It was a Saturday, but the town's air was not one of leisure. Housewives marched with an air of martial duty to inspect jams, pies, and sponge cakes, each bent on detecting, if not sabotage, then at least some technical disqualification in a neighbour's entry. A good scandal over a suspected bought-in strawberry tart could sustain conversation for weeks. Mrs. Edith Banbury, secretary of the organising committee for the past 12 years and custodian of a terrifying shorthand notebook, presided at the judging table like a magisterial swan among ducklings. A plump figure in lilac print, she conferred with the judges in a whisper that carried as effectively as a town crier's bell. Her opinions were rarely resisted, for Edith possessed the kind of social stamina that could wear down any opposition. Beside her, Major Bullimore, chairman of the Borough Parks Committee and more ornamental than useful, was trying not to nod off into the gladiolus. He had been fortified earlier with a gin and tonic of proportions that would have stunned a lesser constitution. His job was to hand out prizes, and he was resolved to manage this without dropping any envelopes, or, worse, any names. At 3 o'clock precisely, the winners were announced. Mrs. Hopgood's Victoria sponge was pronounced light as air, though the town knew it was made with a quantity of custard powder bordering on the reckless. Mr. Preece, the greengrocer, carried off the cup for onions of uniform girth, while Miss Caldecott, who lived alone with 2 elderly sisters and a canary, triumphed yet again with her roses. The applause was dutiful, but contained. One never clapped too loudly lest one appear envious. It was just as the dignitaries retired to the refreshment tent that the peculiar discovery was made. Mrs. Banbury, bustling back towards the exhibits to ensure no child's sticky fingers compromised her kingdom, stopped dead in the poultry section. A crate, ostensibly entered in the best hen, heavy breed category, was covered with sacking. This was against regulation. Birds must be displayed for admiration, not smuggled in like contraband. With an outraged twitch, she pulled aside the cloth. The scream she produced silenced the marquee and turned every head. Inside, slumped at an angle most uncharacteristic of poultry, was the body of a man. His face, waxen and faintly blue, bore the expression of someone who had mislaid both spectacles and patience. The incongruity of his position, knees bent as though he were an awkward exhibit, only sharpened the horror. There was no blood, no weapon, no obvious sign of outrage. Merely the quiet certainty that something indecent had taken place among the chrysanthemums. Word spread with the speed of dandelion seeds. Within moments, the refreshment tent was deserted, teacups abandoned, sausage rolls drying at the edges. The Major was prevented from another gin by a helpful steward who steered him firmly away from the scene. Miss Caldecott's roses drooped unnoticed. By the time Inspector Purbright arrived, walking with his usual calm step, as though he had been invited to a church bazaar, rather than summoned to a corpse, the show ground had reformed itself into a tight ring of gossip. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Men speculated in lowered tones about heart attacks and poison. No one admitted to knowing the dead man, though several were privately rehearsing ways to distance themselves should his identity prove inconvenient. Purbright surveyed the scene without haste. His round, mild face expressed nothing but polite interest, the kind one might give to a neighbour's new greenhouse. Only his eyes, quietly attentive, behind spectacles, suggested calculation. Sergeant Love, already flustered by the spectacle of death among poultry cages, blurted, "What sort of person would do a thing like that, sir?" Purbright, bending to look inside the crate, said mildly, "A rather untidy one, I should think. Still, no doubt we shall see more clearly when we know who he is." He straightened, glanced once around the silent crowd, and then nodded gravely to Mrs. Banbury. "If you would be so good," he said, "perhaps you could tell me whose exhibit this was supposed to be?" Mrs. Banbury, usually formidable, found herself struggling for words. She clutched her notebook as though it were both a shield and a weapon. Why, Inspector, I cannot say at once, but I shall look it up." "Thank you," said Purbright gently, as though he were accepting a cup of weak tea. "That may be the beginning of our little inquiry." The crowd, sensing both reassurance and promise of entertainment, leaned closer. Already the flower show of 1963 was set to be remembered long after the dahlias had withered. By the following morning, Flaxborough was already in possession of several contradictory versions of what had occurred at the flower and produce show. The body in the poultry crate was alternately described as that of a retired sea captain, a London bookmaker on the run, or, according to Mrs. Frobisher, who never allowed the truth to spoil a good whisperon of Edith Banbury's many rejected suitors who had chosen the chrysanthemum marquee as the stage for his final reproach. At breakfast tables across the town, bacon cooled on plates as neighbours speculated. The vicar, consulted at an early hour by Mrs. Jubb the organist, ventured only that these things happen everywhere nowadays, a phrase which suggested both resignation and relief that it had happened here rather than in his vestry. T. Dun Market Cafe, situated at the corner of the High Street, became a kind of unofficial newsroom. There, over cups of tea whose strength was inversely proportional to their price, citizens pieced together the fragments. Mr. Drabble, the chemist, claimed to have recognized the shoes on the deceased as being from his own stocker detail, which implied both familiarity and a certain disappointment that a customer had failed to live long enough to require more polish. Miss Roper, who worked at the library, assured all listeners that she had seen the man before, possibly in the reference section, though she admitted her certainty lessened once it was suggested he might have been a plumber from Barton. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, moved with a deliberate lack of haste. He knew the value of allowing gossip to run unchecked for a while. It not only revealed the town's capacity for invention, but often concealed, somewhere in its embroidery, a loose thread of fact. His morning was spent at the station, listening with half an ear to Sergeant Love's enthusiastic but unproductive speculations. Love, who believed every crime could be solved by sufficient application of common sense and a good stiff caution, declared that the matter was obviously connected with some kind of poultry fraud. Purbright, rubbing a finger thoughtfully along the bridge of his spectacles, merely murmured that it was an unusual choice of hiding place if fraud was the motive. By late afternoon, the identity of the victim had been ascertained. He was Mr. Arthur Soames, a commercial traveller of modest repute, known to have lodged at the Angel Hotel during the previous week. Soames had been in Flaxborough on business connected, somewhat prosaically, with agricultural implements. The landlord recalled him as a quiet man who ate his dinners alone, and seemed to spend a good deal of time studying the notices pinned up in the market hall. News of his name spread with satisfying rapidity. Those who had been firm in their conviction that the deceased was a foreign agent now adopted the air of having always suspected he was a salesman. Mrs. Jubb was heard to remark, with an authority she had not possessed the day before, that travellers were restless folk and often met with ends of this sort. As Purbright walked through the town that evening, he noted the way blinds twitched as he passed. Flaxborough was not unaccustomed to scandal, but the intrusion of sudden death, especially into something as sacred as the flower show, has given its citizens both thrill and unease. Conversations broke off as he entered, shops resumed, louder once he had left. He paused outside the Angel Hotel, watching the comings and goings of guests. The landlord, summoned to the station earlier, had admitted that Soames's bill remained unpaid, a fact which seemed to trouble him more than the man's demise. Among the papers left in his room had been catalogues, a half-written letter, and a small diary that revealed little more than a habit of noting meal times and train departures. There was, however, a peculiarity that had caught Purbright's attention. On the day before the flower show, Soames had written a single word, meeting without further elaboration, no place, no time, no initials, just that one word. As he stood in the fading light, Purbright considered the nature of meetings. They were rarely casual in Flaxborough. A man arranged one because something must be agreed, concealed, or exchanged. And sometimes, he reflected, because something must be settled for good. The inspector adjusted his spectacles, turned, and walked slowly back towards the police station. Behind him, the town hummed with eager tongues, each voice confident it knew the truth. Purbright, however, suspected the truth was still hiding itself quietly, stubbornly, like a hen reluctant to leave its nest. Inspector Purbright believed in the virtues of steady conversation. In Flaxborough, it was seldom the hammer blow of interrogation that brought results, but rather the persistent drip of polite inquiry. He knew that people would talk, sometimes at length, often unwittingly, and if allowed the comfort of their own digressions, they could reveal more than they intended. The morning after Soames's body had been removed from its undignified poultry accommodation, Purbright and Sergeant Love began their round of interviews. They started, quite naturally, with Mrs. Banbury. She received them in her parlour, where the air carried the mingled scents of lavender polish and an impressive display of potpourri. Mrs. Banbury, formidable in her lilac housecoat, sat upright as though still presiding over the flower show's judging table. "My dear Inspector," she began, in the tone of one prepared to set the entire matter to rights, "the whole business is most regrettable. I told the committee years ago that the poultry section was a risk. Chickens bring trouble. Either they escape and flap about, frightening the children, or, well, as we have seen, someone uses their cages for untoward purposes." Purbright nodded, his expression sympathetic. "Quite so, Mrs. Banbury. It must have been a shock to you." "A shock? Inspector, I have hardly slept since. Every time I close my eyes, I see the dreadful sight. Not that I am unused to responsibility. Why, during the blackout, I once had to shepherd 50 parishioners into the church crypt after a false alarm, and I managed perfectly well. But this is different. A corpse in the poultry crate, the very thought." She dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief embroidered with violets. Purbright, watching her closely, noted that the tears remained resolutely absent. He asked gently if she recalled whose entry the crate had been. Mrs. Banbury consulted her notebook with a flourish. "Yes, here it is. The crate was entered under the name of Mr. Preece, the greengrocer, you know, though I cannot imagine he had anything to do with it. He is meticulous. About his onions—" Purbright exchanged a glance with Sergeant Love, who looked distinctly pleased with the prospect of a suspect. "Thank you, Mrs. Banbury," the inspector said, rising. "You have been most helpful." Their next visit took them to Preece's shop. Mr. Preece was a wiry man with a suspiciously luxuriant moustache, which he was forever adjusting, as though it needed constant encouragement to remain in place. The shop smelled of cabbages and floor disinfectant. "The crate?" he repeated when Purbright explained. "Mine? Rubbish! I never had a hen in my life. Vegetables, yes, onions, carrots, leeks, but poultry, not likely." Sergeant Love interjects that Mrs. Banbury's list says it was yours. Preece's moustache twitched indignantly. "Then her list is wrong. I had 2 entries, and both were vegetables. I haven't kept chickens since before the war. Too much bother, and the neighbours complained of the noise. Whoever put my name there did it to shift suspicion, if you ask me." Purbright studied him with mild interest. "You knew Mr. Soames, perhaps?" Priest frowned. "The dead fellow? Only by sight. He came into the shop once or twice. Bought an apple, asked a lot of questions about deliveries, nosy sort. I thought he was some kind of inspector from the ministry, checking up on rationing books." Purbright allowed the silence to stretch. Priest began polishing a lettuce with a cloth, though the gesture looked more nervous than hygienic. Finally he muttered, "Anyway, if you're looking for poultry, you should talk to Fred Appleyard. He keeps half the hens in the district." The name was duly noted. Leaving Priest to his vegetables, the policeman walked along the high street. Love was eager to treat the greengrocer's disavowal as a lie, but Purbright, with his usual calm, said, "Let us not dismiss his suggestion. Appleyard may have something to tell us." Appleyard's small holding lay on the edge of town, a ramshackle affair of sheds, netting, and the unmistakable odour of chickens. He was a tall, stooped man with hands the colour of old leather and eyes narrowed permanently against dust. He listened to their questions with slow consideration. "Priest? No, he hasn't had hens since I can remember. As for that crate mate, I lent it out a week ago. A fellow came by, said he needed something to carry a bird, paid me a shilling deposit, said he'd bring it back." "And who was this fellow?" Purbright asked softly. Appleyard scratched his chin. "Didn't give a name. Middle-aged, tidy sort. Wore a grey suit. Now I think it looked a bit like the picture in the paper yesterday, the one of that chap they found dead." Purbright's eyes did not change, but Love gasped. Soames himself borrowed the crate? Then he put himself in it? Appleyard snorted. "I never said that. I just said it looked like him. Might have been someone else, though." The inspector thanked the farmer and led Love away before the sergeant could press further. As they walked back towards town, Purbright considered the oddity. Why would Soames borrow a poultry crate? And for what purpose could a commercial traveller lodging alone at the Angel Hotel require such a thing? That evening they returned to the hotel. The landlord, a stout man of nervous energy, produced Soames's belongings. The diary with the single entry meeting lay on the desk. Purbright turned the pages slowly, studying the neat but characterless handwriting. Nothing else of note appeared until he reached the back where, scrawled faintly in pencil, was an address: C. Gedge, 14 Elm Row. The landlord, when asked, confirmed he knew of no such person. Sergeant Love was dispatched to check the address. He returned half an hour later with news that the house belonged to a Miss Clara Gedge, a dressmaker. Miss Gedge was a small, angular woman whose manner combined shyness with defiance, as though she expected to be accused of wrongdoing at any moment. She welcomed them into a parlour dominated by a sewing machine and a clutter of fabrics. "Yes, I knew Mr. Soames," she admitted, after some hesitation. "He came to see me twice, wanted to ask about some clothes, not for himself, said he was inquiring for a lady. He showed me a scrap of fabric and asked if I could match it." "What sort of fabric?" Purbright asked. She rummaged among her scraps and produced a piece of pale green silk. "Try this." I told him I didn't have any like it, and he seemed disappointed. Then he asked if I knew who might be in town. I couldn't think of anyone. He thanked me and left. That was last Tuesday. Purbright held the silk carefully. It was the kind of material one might find on a dress intended for evenings rather than everyday use. He asked if Soames had mentioned the lady's name. "No," said Miss Gedge, "but I got the impression she was, well, important to him." He kept smoothing the fabric as if it were her hand. As they left, Sergeant Love remarked, "Could be a mistress, sir? Or a blackmail job. Perhaps he was after some woman in town." Purbright said nothing. His mind lingered on the odd convergence of poultry crates and scraps of silk. Each seemed trivial, yet he had learned that in Flaxborough it was often the trivialities that revealed the deepest truths. The next day brought further threads. Miss Roper at the library, when asked again, recalled that Soames had spent a long time examining old parish records. "Something about family names," she said vaguely. "He asked if there were lists of baptisms from the 1890s. I told him he'd do better at the county archives, but he seemed very interested in the local ones. Family names, a piece of silk, a meeting left unexplained, and then a poultry crate, borrowed under uncertain circumstances." Purbright gathered the fragments in his mind, fitting them together like a puzzle whose picture was still obscure. That evening he wrote out a brief memorandum for his own reference. It contained only 3 lines. 1. Soames in Flaxborough on business not entirely agricultural. 2. Seeks silk lady connected. 3. Meeting with whom. Result death. He placed the paper carefully in his drawer, closed it, and went back to the paperwork that never ceased. Yet even as he did so, he was aware of the town beyond the station walls, restless with gossip. Every conversation, every sideways glance in the street, every whispered speculation at the market cafe was part of the tapestry in which the truth lay hidden. His task, as always, was to tease the pattern free, without haste, without drama, and with patience enough to wait for people to show themselves. For in Flaxborough they always did. By the middle of the week the town had settled, if that was the right word on a theory. It was simple, it was satisfying, and most of all, it was convenient. Arthur Soames, the commercial traveller, had been murdered by Mr. Preece, the greengrocer. Few residents could explain precisely why, but this did not hinder them from asserting it with confidence. He had, after all, been linked by Mrs. Banbury's formidable notebook to the poultry crate. He had denied it, of course, but denials were only further proof. A guilty man always denied. In the market cafe, voices leaned across the marble-topped tables. "He's always been a sly one, that Preece," said Mrs. Hopgood, who had triumphed with her sponge cake. "Keeps himself to himself. And that moustache. I've never trusted a man who fiddles with his moustache so much." Others nodded gravely. The connection between facial hair and criminality, though tenuous, was felt to be persuasive. Mr. Drabble the chemist contributed his observation that Preece had been unusually nervous when buying polish last Thursday. "And you know what nervousness means," he concluded. Even Major Bullimore, when asked his view, declared it was obvious the fellow was up to something, though he was unable to recall exactly what. The councillors, too, were eager for resolution. A murder, however minor, was an inconvenience. It cast a pall over the town's reputation and threatened to deter the tourists who might otherwise have visited the church or bought postcards of the market cross. It was agreed, over a meeting in the mayor's parlour, that the police ought to act swiftly to reassure the public. "Arrest the greengrocer," said Councillor Tegg, who had once been outbid by Preece for a batch of rhubarb crowns. "Show people we won't tolerate crime. That's what they expect." Sergeant Love was inclined to agree. He had listened to the swirl of gossip with a gratifying sense that the town was at last supporting his own instinct. "We've got him pinned, sir," he insisted, as he and Purbright walked back from the mayor's office. The crate was his, the dead man went into it, and Preece was lying. "It all fits." Purbright's round face betrayed nothing beyond mild contemplation. "Is it love? Sometimes what fits too neatly is a suit, borrowed for the occasion. It may be cut down at the seams before long." Love frowned, uncertain whether this was a criticism or merely one of the inspector's curious ways of talking. That afternoon they visited Preece once more. He was arranging apples into an excessively symmetrical pyramid when they entered. His moustache twitched at the sight of them. "Still on about that crate?" he demanded before they spoke. I told you nothing to do with me. You've got half the town staring every time I walk down the street. I won't have it. People do talk, Purbright said mildly. It is their way. But we are more interested in facts than rumours. Well, the fact is I never lent or borrowed or touched a poultry crate. If someone uses my name, then they're framing me. Sergeant Love leaned forward. You knew Soames, though? Priest shook his head. Only what I said before. He came in, nosed around, asked about deliveries. Seemed to be sizing me up. I didn't like him. Did you argue? Not in so many words. He asked too many questions, and I told him so. He left. That was that. Purbright let the silence stretch, studying the man's restless moustache. Then, very quietly, he asked, What sort of questions? Priest hesitated. About customers. Who I supplied, where the produce came from. Like I told you, I thought he was some kind of ministry man. And you told him? Of course not. None of his business. I keep my trade to myself. The inspector nodded as if satisfied. Quite so. Thank you, Mr. Priest. We shan't trouble you further today. Outside, Love was impatient. You're letting him slip through, sir. He's hiding something. We ought to search his place at least. Purbright adjusted his spectacles. No doubt he is hiding something, but whether it is murder, I am not yet persuaded. The truth was that Purbright saw too many untidy edges in the theory. If Priest had killed Soames, why choose such a ludicrous method of concealment? A poultry crate in the middle of a flower show was hardly discreet. And if Priest had truly wished to silence a man making awkward inquiries, would he not have sought a more permanent and private solution? The logic of the case remained elusive. Nevertheless, pressure from the council and the public mounted. The chief constable himself telephoned, in a voice heavy with political caution, to suggest that a show of decisiveness might be in order. Purbright listened politely, gave non-committal replies, and replaced the receiver without comment. Later that evening, he sat alone in his office, rereading the notes in Soames's diary. Meeting, just that word, and the address of Clara Gedge. He recalled the scrap of silk she had shown him, the faint wistfulness in her voice when she spoke of Soames. It was not Priest who occupied his thoughts, but rather an unseen woman in a green dress. Still, he knew the investigation must continue along its public course. The following day, he arranged for a formal interview with Priest at the station. The greengrocer arrived indignant, carrying with him the faint smell of onions. "You can't keep this up," he said furiously. "It's ruining me. Customers look at me like I've poisoned the cabbages." Purbright's manner was calm, almost soothing. "We merely wish to be thorough, Mr. Priest. Tell me again, on the day before the flower show, where were you?" "In the shop, all day. Ask anyone. Mrs. Rudd came in for potatoes, Mr. Blenkinsop for carrots. They'll vouch for me. And in the evening, at home, of course. My wife will tell you she has." "And?" "She said you were restless, up and down, fretting about something." Priest scowled. "The onions! They were late from the supplier. I couldn't sleep worryingly." Sergeant Love pounced. "Or was it Soames you were worrying about? I've told you I hardly knew the man. If you're set on blaming me, go ahead, but you'll look foolish when you find the real killer." Purbright let the protest linger in the air. There was, he thought, an authentic note in the man's anger, not the practiced outrage of guilt, but the weary frustration of one already judged by rumour. When Priest had been dismissed, Love turned eagerly. "Well, sir?" "Well," Purbright replied, "I think we may have reached the end of what Mr. Priest can tell us, for now." That night, Flaxborough buzzed with anticipation that an arrest was imminent. Housewives repeated to each other that the inspector had all but got him. Men in the pub nodded wisely over their pints. The flower show murder, it was agreed, was nearly solved. Only Purbright remained unconvinced. The pieces of silk and scribbled notes, the borrowed crate and the whispered meeting refused to fall into place. It was too early, far too early, to pronounce the case tidy. He suspected that somewhere in the town, perhaps behind a twitching curtain, perhaps at the back of the market cafe, someone else was listening very carefully to the rumour of Priest's guilt and smiling quietly to themselves. The following morning brought a temporary calm. No new revelations stirred the streets, though the cafe and the grocer's still hummed with conjecture about Priest's imminent downfall. Purbright, however, walked to the station with the same unhurried tread as always, his mind turning over the incongruities that refused to settle. The crime, if crime it was, contained a curious carelessness. A body deposited in the middle of a flower show was not the act of a cautious man, unless, of course, the intention was to draw attention, not to avoid it. That thought accompanied him as he sorted his morning papers and found Sergeant Love already eager with news. "Sir, I've checked the crate itself again. Nothing. No prints worth having, just smudges. But listen to this. I did notice something in the straw lining. A theatre ticket. Only half of it, mind, but it's for the Empire Cinema, Tuesday evening show." Purbright accepted the scrap, turning it over with gentle fingers. The Empire's programmes were not the sort to attract men like Soames' westerns, thrillers, and comedies played to half-filled rows. Yet here was a fragment of proof that someone had been there. "Tuesday," he murmured. "That would be the night before the flower show. Love was certain this was the crack that would widen into a full solution. Priest must have dropped it, or maybe Soames. They could have met there." "Perhaps," Purbright said, slipping the ticket into an envelope. "Or perhaps someone wanted us to think so." Later that morning, he strolled to the Empire, where Mr. Brotherton, the manager, received him with a mix of deference and suspicion. The cinema was empty, but for the smell of damp carpets and last night's tobacco. "Tuesday?" Brotherton scratched his head. "That was the cowboy picture, wasn't it? Not many in. Rain kept them away. Do you recall Mr. Soames, middle-aged, greying, wore spectacles?" The manager hesitated. "Could be. There was a fellow sitting near the back, looking like he'd come on his own, left before the end. I remember because he went out in a hurry, almost tripping over the steps. Dropped something, maybe. I found a pencil." "A pencil?" "Yes, ordinary sort. I keep it in the cash box for tallying." "Why? Was he important?" Purbright smiled faintly. "He seems to have been." Back at the station, the inspector laid the pencil alongside the half-ticket. Love frowned. Not much to go on. "Not much, no," Purbright agreed. "But men do not usually go to the cinema simply to leave in haste, nor do they scribble in parish registers without reason. I think Mr. Soames was following something, or someone." That afternoon he visited the library once again. Miss Roper, who prided herself on vigilance, confirmed that Soames had indeed taken down parish record books. "He copied out names," she whispered. "I glanced at his paper when he went to the desk. Mostly surnames: Dunn, Hatherley, Blunt. Old families. Some of them are still in town." "Did he ask you anything about the names?" she thought. "Only if there were connections. Marriages. I said the archives at the county hall would be better, but he seemed determined to search here." The list of surnames stayed in Purbright's mind as he walked back through the drizzle. They were names he had heard in Flaxborough many times, scattered across gravestones, shop fronts, and council committees. Yet what interest would they hold for a commercial traveller, unless his business had been of a very different kind? That evening, as he sat at his desk, another triviality occurred to him. Mrs. Banbury, in her account of discovering the body, had mentioned the crate being covered by sacking. That had seemed unremarkable at the time. Yet when he considered it again, it struck him as peculiar. Who, entering a competition, would hide their entry from view? Exhibits were displayed, not concealed. If Soames himself had placed the crate there, why cover it? And if another had done so, why risk the suspicion that concealment must arouse? The thought nagged at him. He rose, paced the office, and finally summoned Love. "We must look at the sacking," he said. The cloth had been bundled with other detritus after the show and deposited in a shed behind the town hall. With some rummaging, they found rough burlap, frayed at the edges, smelling faintly of poultry. Purbright held it to the light, peering at the weave. There, faint but visible, were several black smudges. "Grease," Love said at once. "From the crate hinges," Purbright touched the marks thoughtfully. "Grease, yes, or ink." The sergeant looked blank. "Ink, possibly. We shall see." He had the cloth sent to the county laboratory, though he expected little from their methods. What interested him more was not the substance itself, but the suggestion it carried that the covering might once have served another purpose. Days slipped by, the town's impatience mounting. Councillors pressed for action. The chief constable called again. But Purbright continued in his quiet, deliberate way, listening more than he spoke, watching more than he questioned. He visited the tailor, the postmaster, even the verger, each time gleaning scraps of talk about Soames. He learned that the traveller had been seen near Elm Row more than once, loitering without entering. He learned, too, that he had posted a letter on the morning of his death, though to whom no one knew. The odd detail of the sacking returned with renewed force when the laboratory reported faint traces of printer's ink, mixed with grease. Purbright considered this carefully. A sheet of burlap that had once been pressed into service at a printing works, perhaps. He thought of the town's one surviving press, run by a man named Willard, who produced bills, handouts, and occasional leaflets for the council. Willard was a talkative man with a permanent smell of ink about him. "Yes, Inspector, I've had plenty of that sacking," he admitted readily. "We use it to wrap the rolls of paper. When they're finished, I give them away, farmers mostly, for covering plants, lining sheds. And to whom have you given some recently? Oh, half the town, let me think. Appleyard, the poultry fellow, took a bundle last month. Priest had some once, though not lately. And Mrs. Jubb, the organist, wanted it for her garden." The circle widened again, and Purbright allowed it to do so. He knew that in Flaxborough, webs of acquaintance stretched across every street, often tangled, never straight. What mattered was not the breadth, but the one thread that tugged differently from the rest. It came unexpectedly from Miss Gedge, the dressmaker. Purbright called again, carrying the fragment of green silk she had shown him before. He asked if anyone else in town had ever brought her something similar. She hesitated, then said, "Well, yes. About a month ago, Mrs. Hopgood came in. Wanted me to match some ribbon for her daughter's dress. It was almost the same shade." Purbright's eyebrows rose slightly. Mrs. Hopgood, the proud winner of the sponge cake prize, was not a name he had considered. A respectable matron, forthright in committee work, with a husband who sold farm machinery. Hardly the stuff of scandal. Yet Soames had gone from Miss Gedge with disappointment, still searching for the match. Could it be that he had been seeking not fabric, but a woman who wore it? On his way back, Purbright paused at the market cafe. Mrs. Hopgood herself was there, in vigorous conversation about the greengrocer's supposed guilt. She wore a hat adorned with artificial flowers, her cheeks flushed with satisfaction. Purbright, ordering tea, watched the way she commanded her companion's attention. He noticed a small pin at her collar, a green stone set in brass. It was not silk, but its colour echoed the fragment in his pocket. Later, in his office, he wrote a single note. "Mrs. Connection with Green?" Love, seeing the line, was astonished. "Surely not her, sir. Everyone says it's Priest. Everyone often does," Purbright replied gently. "That is why I listen to things that do not fit. A crate covered, when it should not be, a scrap of fabric with no owner, a cinema ticket dropped in haste. The These are trifles, yet trifles have a way of leading us. The sergeant looked doubtful, but Purbright had already turned to the window. Outside, the lamps glowed in the mist, and the town moved on in its usual patterns, buying, selling, gossiping. Somewhere within those patterns was the hand that had guided Arthur Soames into death. And it was not, he felt increasingly sure, the hand of Mr. Preece. The notion that Mrs. Hopgood, champion of sponge cakes and guardian of respectable conversation, might have had any connection with Arthur Soames would have struck most of Flaxborough as absurd. Yet Purbright, who had learned never to take absurdities at face value, allowed the idea to rest quietly in his mind. He did not at once act upon it. To lunge directly at such a figure would stir the town into defensive uproar. Instead, he let the suspicion guide his next steps, which were, as ever, unhurried and polite. It was on a Wednesday afternoon that Purbright, accompanied by Sergeant Love, visited the Angel Hotel again. The landlord greeted them with the mixture of unease and eagerness peculiar to those who believe themselves to be at the heart of important affairs. He ushered them into the lounge and produced Soames's belongings once more. "There's something else, sir," the landlord said, lowering his voice as though confessing a misdemeanor. "One of the maids swears she saw a lady visiting him. Not in his room, mind you, but at the front desk. Said they talked quietly like they knew each other. The maid didn't recognize her. Purbright asked, without hurry, for a description. Shortish, well-dressed, wearing gloves. Green coat, she thought. That was the day before the flower show. The inspector's gaze flickered just enough for Love to notice. When they left, the sergeant burst out a green coat. "That fits, sir." "That's your silk again, isn't it?" "Possibly," Purbright said. "Possibly not. A coat is not a dress, and colours have a way of deceiving us." Still, the recollection lingered as they went about their rounds. The address of Clara Gedge had not yet been fully explained. Purbright called upon her once more, finding her bent over her sewing machine with a pile of garments that looked like they had all been mended before. "Miss Gedge," he asked, "when Mr. Soames visited you, did he say who had given him your name?" She looked puzzled. "No, Inspector, he just walked in off the street. But now you ask, I did hear him mention Mrs. Banbury. Said he'd been directed to me by her. Something about reliable needlework. It was a small shift, but a notable one. Soames, searching for the source of a green fabric, had been pointed in Miss Gedge's direction, not by accident, but by recommendation. And Mrs. Banbury, who had found the body, had therefore known that Soames was making such inquiries. When confronted with this later in her parlour, Mrs. Banbury bristled. "Yes, I told him about Miss Gedge. Why should I not? The man asked if there was a good dressmaker in town, and I said Clara was respectable. There was nothing in it." Purbright inclined his head in agreement, but in his mind another thread had been knotted. Soames, the green silk, a meeting, a crate in the poultry tent. All these trivialities were tugging in directions no one else wished to see. Meanwhile, the gossip that had fixed Preece as the guilty party began to fray at the edges. Appleyard, the poultryman, was heard to declare loudly in the pub that if anyone's fit for hanging, it's them that hides cloth under hens. Others wondered aloud why a greengrocer, whose entire livelihood depended on custom, would risk being caught with a corpse in tow. Suspicion, having grown fat on certainty, now began to nibble at other names. One such name was Clara Gedge herself. Whispers suggested that a lonely dressmaker might easily have been infatuated with a traveller, and infatuation, when rejected, could turn deadly. The theory was embroidered with tales of her walking late at night, of curtains drawn tight against the street, of scraps of silk glimpsed in her hands. Purbright listened without comment, but he knew Clara's timidity was unlikely to extend to murder. What did interest him, however, was her link to the Banbury recommendation, and through that, the network of women who managed half the town's affairs beneath the cloak of respectability. He turned next to Mrs. Jubb, the organist, whose garden was known to be draped in Willard's discarded sacking. Her house smelled of polish and hymn books. She received Purbright with nervous courtesy. "The flower show? Yes, I was there all day, Inspector, playing for the children's choir in the morning, then helping with teas. I never saw the poor man, though, not until people said what had happened." Purbright's eyes wandered around the parlour and alighted on a heap of sacking in the corner, partly concealing a flower pot. He asked casually where she had obtained it. "Why, from Mr. Willard at the press. He's always giving it away. Very useful for frost." She spoke with such matter-of-fact innocence that he did not press her further. Yet the ubiquity of the sacking only deepened the puzzle. Too many people had access to it. The marks on the piece covering the crate could have come from anywhere. The detail remained trivial, but it was trivialities that mattered. As the week drew on, Purbright made a point of visiting the Empire Cinema again, this time on the evening of a performance. He sat quietly at the back, while a thin crowd watched a melodrama of bandits and heroes. He noticed how couples slipped in discreetly, how certain figures lingered in the foyer, how shadows provided cover for meetings that wished not to be observed. When the lights came up, he remained seated, considering the half-ticket and the pencil once more. Soames was there on Tuesday. Whom had he met or tried to meet? It was a small encounter on the way home that provided another thread. Passing the market cross, Purbright encountered Councillor Tegg, slightly flushed from his dinner. The councillor greeted him with forced joviality. "Evening, Inspector. Still chasing shadows? I hear you've been pestering good women folk with questions about silk and chickens. You'll be after my rhubarb next." Purbright smiled politely. The truth, councillor, often hides in what seems least important. The councillor harumphed, then added, "Well, if you want to know who's been sneaking about with whom, I could tell you a thing or two. But that's not police business, eh? Just neighbourly concern." The remark was offered as jest, but Purbright filed it away. Councillors knew more of the town's secrets than they admitted, and sometimes they betrayed them in careless banter. The following day, Miss Roper from the library sought Purbright out. She was flushed with the thrill of being helpful. "Inspector, I remembered something. That man," Soames asked, particularly about the Hopgood family name, said it was on his list. He seemed interested in whether there had ever been a Hopgood connection with the Dunns. I told him I wasn't sure, but that the records might show. Here at last was a stronger link. Soames had not only sought silk and spoken with Mrs. Hopgood, he had researched her family. Why? Was it mere curiosity, or something deeper? That evening, Purbright considered the chain. Soames inquires about families, takes notes, visits a dressmaker, asks for green silk, is directed there by Mrs. Banbury, meets a lady in green at the Angel, attends the cinema, and the next day is found dead in a crate, under sacking that bore ink marks from a press. The line was crooked, the points scattered, but each was pulling toward the same centre. When Love pressed again for an arrest, Purbright shook his head. Not yet. A crime in Flaxborough is never so simple as the first gossip claims. Someone wanted us to look at Priest, and perhaps even at Miss Gedge, but the hand that arranged these trifles belongs to someone who understands the town's habits well. Love frowned. "And who would that be, sir?" Purbright did not answer directly. He simply gazed out of the window at the lamps along the high street, their glow caught in the mist, and allowed himself a thin smile, for he knew that the investigation was beginning to widen, drawing in those who had believed themselves untouched. And, soon enough, when another small but telling incident occurred, the picture would sharpen. Until then he would wait, letting the town reveal itself as it always did, through gossip, error, and the quiet betrayals of everyday life. The rhythm of Flaxborough life, though disturbed, had not ceased. Shops opened, gossip ran its course, and the church bells chimed with the same dogged regularity. Yet beneath the surface, a sense of expectancy lingered, as if the town itself were holding its breath. Inspector Purbright felt it too, though he showed no sign. He moved through his days with his usual mildness, listening to chatter, following the faintest trails of trivialities, waiting for the moment when another piece would fall into place. It came, as such moments often did, unexpectedly. On a damp Thursday evening, Sergeant Love burst into the inspector's office with the air of a man who had at last found proof of his own instincts. "Sir, there's been another business connected with this Soames affair. A break-in at Willard's printing works." Purbright set down his pen without hurry. "Willard's? What was taken? That's just it, nothing of value. The till was untouched, machines all there, but papers were scattered everywhere as if someone had been searching for something." The inspector rose and collected his coat. "Then we had better see what it was they hoped to find." Willard's premises smelled heavily of ink and damp paper. The proprietor himself, flustered and eager for sympathy, waved his inky hands about as he described the outrage. "Smashed the side window, Inspector, right in, came through and ransacked the place, piles of proofs thrown about, drawers rifled, but they didn't touch the cash box, not a shilling missing." "You tell me, what sort of thief does that?" Purbright bent to examine the littered floor. Scraps of paper, half-printed leaflets, advertising bills. Among them lay a heap of discarded sacking, some frayed, some still faintly marked with black. He turned over a sheet with his toe, noting the sharp crease as though someone had folded it carefully before tossing it aside. "Did you miss any particular paper?" he asked. Willard scratched his head. "Hard to say. We keep old records, invoices. Maybe one of them's gone." "Why, I can't imagine, unless some fool thought we had bonds hidden here." Purbright made no reply, but his eyes moved slowly around the clutter. It was not theft, that much was clear. It was a search. And not the blind rummaging of a desperate burglar, but the deliberate hunt of someone who knew or believed a specific document mattered. Outside, Love could hardly contain his excitement. "Don't you see, sir? This proves it's all tied to Priest and the crate." The sacking came from Willard's. Someone knew it would point to him, so they went back to cover their tracks. "We've got them now." "Or perhaps," Purbright said gently, "someone wanted us to think so." Again. The news of the breaking spread as swiftly as the news of the body had done. By morning, Flaxborough was alive with new rumours. Theories sprouted like mushrooms after rain. Some said Soames had been blackmailing a council member, and documents proving it had been hidden at the press. Others were sure the printing works had been used to produce seditious pamphlets, and Soames had stumbled on the secret. The town's imagination, always fertile, produced motives enough to sustain conversation for weeks. But Purbright's mind lingered on the trivial again. In the midst of chaos at Willard's, someone had folded a sheet of sacking neatly before discarding it. He found the gesture curious. The smallest care, shown in the middle of disorder, suggested a person whose habits could not easily be set aside. That same day, Miss Roper at the library provided another scrap. She remembered, with belated clarity, that Soames had copied a passage from a parish register in which the name Hopgood was linked by marriage to the Dunn family. He wrote it down very carefully, she said, almost underlined it. I didn't think it was important at the time. Now the strands began to draw tighter. The Hopgoods again, bound to names Soames had sought. A lady in a green coat at the Angel, a scrap of silk, and now a burglary at Willard's, where sacking linked to the crate had originated. Purbright walked through town that evening in a light drizzle. The shops were shuttered, but lights burned in parlours where voices rose and fell. He thought of the town as a stage where every actor believed they were playing a minor role, while in truth each gesture and word was part of a larger script. His task was to read the play before the actors themselves knew the ending. It was Love, of all people, who stumbled upon the next curious event. Sent to take statements from residents near Willard's, he called later at the station, flushed and triumphant. "Sir, you'll want to hear this. Old Mr. Blenkinsop swears he saw someone leaving the press on the night of the break-in. A woman, he says, small, quick, wearing a hat pulled low." "A woman," Purbright repeated. "Did he recognize her?" "No, sir," said she moved too fast. "But he was certain it wasn't a man." The inspector leaned back in his chair. The image of Mrs. Hopgood in her green coat returned to him, though he kept the thought to himself. A respectable matron, creeping from a printing works at night, was laughable. And yet, in Flaxborough, it was always the respectable matron one ought to look at twice. He asked Love to find out discreetly whether Mrs. Hopgood had been at home that night. The sergeant, flushed with importance, promised to inquire. By the following morning he reported that her daughter had claimed her mother had spent the evening knitting in the parlour. A respectable alibi, though one easily offered. The inspector was neither satisfied nor dismissive. He let the fact rest alongside the others, part of a pattern still faint. 2 days later, another ripple spread through town. At the Angel Hotel, a letter addressed to Soames was discovered beneath the carpet in his room. The maid, shifting furniture for dusting, had found it crumpled. The envelope was unmarked but for his name. Inside was a single sheet, bearing only the words, "Elm Row, Tuesday, 9." The date fitted precisely with the night Soames had gone to the cinema and left abruptly. Purbright read the note several times. It was an appointment, plain, direct. Elm Row was Clara Gedge's street. 9 o'clock was an hour when meetings could pass unseen. Yet Soames had ended that evening at the Empire, not at Elm Row. Had the meeting failed, or had he been diverted? Love was certain it pointed again to Clara. She lured him, sir. That's why he wrote her address in his diary. She sent the note. He went. She wasn't there, so he killed time in the pictures. Then, well, whatever happened after. Purbright listened, then folded the paper carefully and placed it in his file. Perhaps, Love. Or perhaps she was not the only one living in Elm Row. The sergeant blinked. You mean someone else? Almost everyone in Flaxborough lives near someone else. That is the difficulty. But inside, Purbright felt the investigation shift. The neatness of the note, the burgled printing works, the family names in the parish book, all now hinted at a design more deliberate than the clumsy murder people preferred to imagine. Someone had lured Soames into a web, whether through genealogy, silk, or secrecy. Someone who understood that in Flaxborough reputation was as strong a currency as money and perhaps more dangerous. As he walked home through the mist that night, Purbright reflected that the second incident had revealed the true shape of the affair. The body in the crate had been shocking, yes, but clumsy. The burglary at Willard's, the hidden letter, the folded sacking, these were the signs of a hand that worked with greater care. A hand belonging to someone who still believed themselves unseen. The inspector smiled faintly, almost kindly, into the dark. Such people always forgot that in Flaxborough nothing remained unseen forever. The discovery of the note beneath the carpet at the Angel gave Purbright the pretext he had been waiting for. He did not leap to confront Clara Gedge, nor summon Mrs. Hopgood for a round of indignant denials. Instead, He carried the folded paper back to his office, placed it on his blotter, and sat with it for some time as though it were a specimen under glass. A meeting at Elm Row, Tuesday 9. Soames had not been found at Elm Row, but at the cinema. The note was not simply a message, it was a question, and questions in Flaxborough always deserved patient listening. He leaned back, staring at the low ceiling of his office, letting the fragments arrange themselves. Soames's diary with its solitary meeting, the list of family names copied from parish registers, the fragment of silk that had led him first to Clara Gedge and then by hearsay to Mrs. Hopgood. The crate was borrowed from Appleyard, later found with Soames's body inside. The sacking from Willard's press, marked with ink. A woman seen slipping from the press after the break-in. A lady in a green coat speaking to Soames at the Angel. Each detail on its own looked small, almost laughably so, but together they formed a quiet insistence. Purbright had always distrusted the human desire for neatness. People in their ordinary lives did not behave with tidy motives. They acted from vanity, envy, longing, fear motives that seldom ran in straight lines. A murder framed as a greengrocer's quarrel was too clean, too public. The truth lay in the muddle, in the overlooked trivialities that revealed the clumsy humanity behind appearances. Love came in, hopeful as ever. "Sir, shall I bring Miss Gedge in for questioning?" The note says Elm Row. Her address is Elm Row. It's as plain as day. Purbright smiled faintly. The son, love, appears plain enough too. Yet it is a great deal more complicated than it looks from here. No, let Miss Gedge be. She will tell us more by her silence than by any confession. The sergeant muttered about wasted time, but Purbright's calm was unshakable. He sent Love instead to fetch the old electoral rolls, reasoning that if Soames had been investigating families, then the names he copied must mean something beyond idle curiosity. Left alone, the inspector turned again to his reflections. He thought of Mrs. Hopgood, outwardly confident, gossipy, pleased with her social footing. Yet why had her name appeared among those Soames had written down? Why is the silk so similar to the fragment he had carried? And why, of all the women in town, was she described as being in conversation with Soames at the hotel? Respectability could hide many things: illicit attachments, financial embarrassments, even old scandals long buried in parish books. A family tie, obscure but sensitive, might have given Soames leverage. But leverage to what end? Blackmail was a word people used readily, but it was rarely as common as gossip suggested. More often it was curiosity itself that killed a man asking questions who stumbled on answers no one wanted repeated. If Soames had unearthed an inconvenient marriage or a child's paternity long disguised, then any number of townsfolk might have wished him silent. The break-in at Willard's confirmed that documents mattered. Whoever entered had not sought money but papers. That meant they believed Soames had left a trace there, or had intended to. And the folded sacking in the midst of disorder was the sign that intrigued him most. A trivial crease, yes, but it spoke of someone unable to discard their own orderliness even while committing crime. By the time Love returned with the rolls, Purbright's mind had settled into its quiet pattern of possibilities. They spent the evening at his desk, thumbing through old lists of voters, noting how the surnames matched the parish records Soames had copied. Dunn was linked to Hopgood by a marriage 30 years past. Blunt linked to Hatherley by another. Nothing scandalous on the surface, yet in a town where reputations mattered more than realities, even a whisper of connection could be dangerous. "Seems dull to me," Love grumbled, rubbing his eyes. "What does it matter who married who before the war?" "It matters," Purbright replied softly, "because Soames thought it did, and someone believed he must be stopped from asking further." After Love departed, the inspector remained alone. Outside the station windows the mist thickened, muffling the lamps. He allowed himself a rare moment of weariness. Murder, even in Flaxborough, was never an abstract puzzle. It was the clumsy outcome of someone's pride, shame, or longing. He thought of Soames, a traveller who had come into the town with nothing but catalogues and curiosity, and had ended up among the chrysanthemums, reduced to an object of gossip. What small vanity had drawn him here? What hope of advantage, or perhaps romance? The green silk came back to him again. Fabric was not in itself damning, but it symbolized something fragile and personal. Soames had carried it like a clue to a private world. Had it belonged to a woman he pursued, or to a family whose past he meant to reveal? In either case, it had led him into someone else's secret. Secrets in Flaxborough were never about grandeur. They were about small disgraces, a hasty marriage, an inconvenient child, a business swindle dressed up as civic duty. Yet small disgraces were the very things most fiercely protected. Purbright's gaze fell once more on the note. Elm Row, Tuesday, 9. Why leave it hidden under the carpet? Because Soames had concealed it himself, or because someone had done so after his death? The handwriting was neat, feminine perhaps, though it could have been disguised. He had not shown it to Clara yet, nor to Mrs. Hopgood. Better to wait, to let the note exist in his own file alone, until the right moment came. He rose and paced the office slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. The townspeople, in their eagerness to believe Priest guilty, had overlooked the subtler hints. That suited him well. A suspect too quickly chosen was as good as a shield for the real culprit. The more the town talked, the safer the truth became for the one who knew it. Purbright reflected, not without a trace of irony, on how murder in Flaxborough was always both sordid and absurd. The manner of Soames's death, hidden in a crate, meant for hens would provide stories for years to come. Yet behind the absurdity lay something quiet, almost pathetic, a fear of exposure, the terror that neighbours might learn what one had long concealed. He had seen it before. He would see it again. He returned to his desk and wrote a single line on a slip of paper, motive concealment of past connection. He placed it beneath the note, closed the file, and extinguished the lamp. Walking home through the dim streets, he observed how windows glowed faintly through lace curtains. Behind each lay lives that to their owners felt perfectly ordinary, but which, under scrutiny, were patched with secrets. He wondered briefly whether the murderer, whoever they were, was even now sitting at their supper, heart beating a little faster at each knock of a spoon. When he reached his own door, he paused, breathed the cool mist, and let his thoughts rest. Tomorrow, he knew, would bring the chance to test his growing suspicion, not with accusations, not with bluster, but with the kind of gentle probing that caused people to trip over their own inventions. In Flaxborough, truth was not dragged out. It was coaxed like a reluctant hen from a coop, and when it came, it would come quietly, almost politely. The note from Elm Row still lay in Purbright's desk the next morning, a folded scrap of paper with a weight far greater than its size. He looked at it once more before slipping it into his pocket, not as evidence to be presented, but as a prop in a quiet experiment. In Flaxborough, truth was rarely wrested from its keeper by force. It was coaxed out, sometimes without the keeper realizing what they had surrendered. Today he decided he would coax. He began not with Clara Gedge, but with Mrs. Hopgood. It was market day, and the square was alive with barrows, baskets, and the lowing of cattle. Mrs. Hopgood was in her element, directing the stall-holders with as much confidence as she had judged sponge cakes. She greeted the inspector with cheerful familiarity. "Inspector Purbright, I trust you've caught your murderer by now. We can't have visitors thinking Flaxborough isn't safe for a decent show." Purbright smiled with his usual mildness. "We are making progress, Mrs. Hopgood. May I trouble you for a few moments' conversation?" She seemed pleased, almost flattered, to be consulted. He drew her aside near the butter stall, where the hubbub of trade formed a screen for quiet words. "I wonder," he said, "if you recall speaking with Mr. Soames at the Angel Hotel last week." Her eyes flickered, but her tone was brisk. "Oh yes, I did happen to see him there. Perfectly ordinary. He asked me about the flower show arrangements, that's all." "Indeed, that is curious. He had written in his diary a single word: meeting. I wondered if you might have been at that meeting." Her laugh was quick and bright, but a little too loud. "Good gracious, no, why would I meet a man like that, a traveller with catalogues?" "Hardly my circle, Inspector." Purbright inclined his head gravely. "Forgive me. It was only a thought. One sometimes assumes connections where there are none." He let the words rest, then produced the folded note as though idly. "This was found in his room. It mentions Elm Row. I wondered whether it meant anything to you." For the smallest fraction of a moment her composure slipped, a flicker of recognition, swiftly veiled. "Elm Row. That's where that dressmaker lives, isn't it? What's her name, Gedge?" Well, perhaps he was meeting her. Not me, certainly. Purbright tucked the note back into his pocket with a mild, "Quite so." He did not press further, but the seed had been planted. The slip, brief as it was, had told him enough the note was not a surprise to her. He left her in the bustle of the market, her voice quickly rising again as she addressed a neighbour. But he saw how her hands busied themselves with her basket, restless in a way that betrayed unease. That afternoon he paid a visit to Clara Gedge. The dressmaker, pale and awkward, looked startled to see him again. He seated himself gently, remarking on the neatness of her stitches, before asking, almost casually, "Hey, did you by any chance expect Mr. Soames on Tuesday evening?" Her eyes widened. "Accept him?" "No. Why should I?" Purbright regarded her kindly. "I wondered because a note was found in his room, mentioning Elm Row, 9 o'clock. Since your house is in Elm Row, I thought perhaps it referred to you." She shook her head vigorously. "No, Inspector, he never wrote to me. He came here twice, yes, but I never encouraged him. He seemed lonely, perhaps. But I don't write notes to men I barely know." There was a tremor in her denial, but not the tremor of guilt, rather that of a woman afraid of being drawn into scandal. Purbright believed her. It was not Clara who had written the summons. Someone else in Elm Row had. Someone with more at stake. When he returned to the station, Sergeant Love was eager as ever. "Well, sir?" "Did she admit it?" "No," Purbright said, "and I think she told the truth. Miss Gedge may have been used as a screen. A note mentioning Elm Row would point to her, just as the crate pointed to Priest. Yet both may be distractions." Love frowned. "But who else lives in Elm Row?" "Many people. But only some have reason to fear what Soames might have discovered." The inspector let the matter rest, but the following day he set in motion his small test. It was the flower show. Committee meeting called in Edith Banbury's parlour to discuss next year's arrangements. Purbright, arriving with polite apologies, asked if he might trouble the committee with a few questions, "since you are all together, and it saves me from disturbing you separately." The ladies and councillors gathered, pleased to be consulted officially. Purbright began gently, asking about the sequence of exhibits, the security of the marquee, the lists of entrants. He let them talk, correcting one another, rehearsing their grievances. Then at a moment when the chatter had reached its height, he slipped in a question so mild it sounded almost trivial. "I wonder," he said, whether any of you happened to walk down Elm Row on Tuesday evening last week, around 9? There was a sudden hush, a pause, so slight most would not have noticed. But Purbright saw that Mrs. Hopgood's hand froze halfway to her teacup. A breath later, she laughed too quickly. "Good heavens, Inspector, what an odd question. Elm Row at 9? I was at home, of course, knitting. My daughter will tell you so." The others nodded, murmured their own denials, and the conversation resumed. But Purbright had seen enough. His test had been to simply mention Elm Row in public and watch who stumbled. Only one had. He left the meeting with quiet thanks and walked back through the twilight streets. Love, trotting beside him, asked eagerly, "Well, sir, what did you see?" "A lady who knits very industriously," Purbright replied, his tone dry. "So industriously that she nearly forgot her tea when I mentioned Elm Row." Love blinked. "You mean Mrs. Hopgood?" Purbright did not answer directly. Instead, he looked up at the lamps just beginning to glow. There is always a moment, love, when a mask slips. We must be ready to notice it. Masks are rarely dropped, they are adjusted. And in adjusting, the truth peers through. That night, in the quiet of his office, Purbright laid out the fragments once again. The green silk, the neat handwriting on the note, the folded sacking, the family names copied from registers. Each was trivial, but together they spoke of someone careful, someone concerned with appearances, someone whose respectability mattered more than anything else. Mrs. Hopgood's sponge cake had won the prize, her hat had been admired, her voice had led the chorus of suspicion against priests. She was, in every way, the embodiment of a respectable Flaxborough matron. And yet it was she who had flinched at the mention of Elm Row. Purbright allowed himself a slow breath. The test had not proved guilt, but it had revealed direction. The time was not yet ripe for confrontation, but the path was now clearer. What remained was to let the guilty hand betray itself further, to create the moment where silence would no longer serve. That moment, he knew, would not be long in coming. Inspector Purbright was not a man who relished performance, yet he knew that sometimes the truth needed an audience. A quiet word in a back parlour might have sufficed to bring matters to their end, but such a method would have denied Flaxborough what it truly demanded, an explanation it could pass from mouth to mouth until the last detail was embroidered into permanence. And so on the following Monday afternoon, he invited several key persons to assemble in the mayor's parlour, a room sufficiently imposing to lend the occasion weight, but sufficiently neutral to avoid accusations of favour. They came, some with curiosity, some with indignation, and one or two with carefully rehearsed innocence. Mrs. Banbury sat stiffly, notebook clutched like a shield. Mr. Preece arrived flushed, moustache bristling, half triumphant at being summoned among the accusers rather than as the accused. Clara Gedge looked pale, drawn, anxious to be anywhere but there. Mrs. Hopgood entered last, cheeks pink from the brisk walk, hat firmly pinned, and lips arranged in their customary blend of cheer and authority. She greeted her neighbours as if the gathering was simply another committee meeting. Purbright began without drama. He stood near the mantel, spectacles glinting mildly in the light, and spoke in the tone of a man discussing allotment rentals. "We have, as you know, been occupied with the most unfortunate death of Mr. Arthur Soames. At first sight it appeared to be an accident, or a matter of some trivial quarrel. Yet the manner of concealment, the setting, and certain details led me to believe otherwise. Today, I would like to tell you what those details reveal." A hush fell. Even Mrs. Banbury's notebook was forgotten for the moment. Purbright's voice remained gentle. Soames was a commercial traveller, but he was also, it seems, a man with a curiosity for history. He spent time in the library, copying out family names, among them the Hopgoods, Dunns, Hatherleys, old families of Flaxborough. He was piecing together connections, marriages, lineages. This, I think, was no idle pursuit. It led him to believe that a certain fact, long buried, might be uncovered. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Alongside this, he carried with him a fragment of green silk. He sought its match. He asked Miss Gedge about it, and she could not supply it. But he continued searching. A lady in a green coat was seen with him at the Angel Hotel. That lady, I believe, was Mrs. Hopgood. There was a stir at this. Mrs. Hopgood gave a laugh, but it was too brittle. Really, Inspector, what nonsense! I was never alone with that man. I may have exchanged a few words, yes, but nothing more. Purbright inclined his head as though accepting her protest. Perhaps. Yet a note was found in his room. Elm Row, Tuesday, 9. Elm Row, where Miss Gedge lives, but also where others are known. The note was in a hand too neat to be his, and I am satisfied it was written by a woman. Clara gave a small gasp, but Purbright raised a calming hand. Not you, Miss Gedge. You told me the truth. You never wrote to him. But another woman had cause to summon him to Elm Row, and then to ensure he did not speak of what he had learned. He let his gaze drift across the room until it came to rest, gently but firmly, on Mrs. Hopgood. You, madam. The silence that followed was sharp as glass. Mrs. Hopgood's cheeks flushed a deeper red. She attempted a smile. Inspector, you must be mistaken. Why on earth would I write to such a man? Because he had discovered what you had tried so long to forget. 30 years ago, before your marriage, there was a child. Born quietly, fostered out, never spoken of. But the registers remain. Soames read them. He asked about connections between the Dunns and the Hopgoods. He had stumbled upon the record of your youth, a marriage never sanctified, a child never acknowledged. He meant to use this knowledge perhaps for money, perhaps for advantage. And you could not risk that. A ripple of shock moved through the room. Mrs. Banbury muttered, "Good gracious," while Priest stared, moustache frozen in astonishment. Mrs. Hopgood's hands gripped her handbag so tightly the leather creaked. "This is outrageous," she said, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "Even if such a thing were true, why should I kill him? Why not simply deny it?" Purbright's tone remained calm. "Because he had proof. He had that scrap of silk kept from a dress you once wore, handed down and preserved. He had traced its match to you. He knew enough to speak with confidence, and so you lured him with a note, intending perhaps to persuade him to silence. But persuasion failed. He grew impatient, went to the cinema to wait, and later you met him again. What passed between you I cannot say in detail, but he did not live to tell the town his discovery. Love, unable to restrain himself, burst out. "And the poultry crate, sir?" Purbright nodded gravely. "Yes, the crate, conveniently borrowed from Appleyard by Soames himself, though he may not have known it. When he was dead, Mrs. Hopgood needed to dispose of him. The flower show with its bustle provided cover. She placed him in the crate, covered it with sacking taken from Willard's press sacking she often used in her garden. She thought the show would pass before the body was noticed. But Mrs. Banbury, diligent as ever, uncovered it too soon. Mrs. Hopgood's lips trembled. She opened them as if to protest, then closed them again. The room held its breath. Purbright's voice was quiet. "And there is the burglary at Willard's. Proof, if proof were needed, that someone feared documents might remain proof of that forgotten child, perhaps of other ties. A woman was seen leaving the press that night, small, quick, the hat pulled low. Who else, Mrs. Hopgood, but you?" The matron gave a small cry, a sound between anger and despair. Her hands loosened from the handbag, which fell to the floor with a dull thud. "He would have ruined me," she whispered. everything I've built. My husband, my daughter, they know nothing. I couldn't let him tell me." The silence that followed was heavy with the shock of revelation. Even Mrs. Banbury, who prided herself on never being surprised, sat back as though struck. Purbright did not gloat nor raise his voice. He simply said, "It is not for me to judge the rights and wrongs of 30 years past, but to take a life, Mrs. Hopgood, is always the greatest mistake." Sergeant Love moved forward awkwardly, fumbling with his notebook as if it might shield him from the enormity of the moment. Mrs. Hopgood sat still, eyes fixed on the floor. Her authority crumbled into silence. And so the truth, when it came, was not shouted, but spoken quietly, in the calm civility of a parlour. Flaxborough had its answer, though the gossip that would follow would shape the tale in countless ways. For Purbright, the work was almost done. There remained only the paperwork, the quiet recording of statements, the endless forms that reduced tragedy to neat lines of ink. As the gathering dispersed, murmuring, shocked, eager to repeat every word, Purbright lingered a moment by the mantel. He looked at the faces leaving the room, indignation, triumph, pity, disbelief. Then he turned back to his papers, his expression as mild and unreadable as ever. The affair of the flower show was nearly over, and in the quiet of his mind he reflected once more that in Flaxborough it was always the trifles, the silk, the sacking, the slip of the hand at the mention of Elm Row that revealed the gravest secrets. In the days that followed, Flaxborough returned with remarkable swiftness to its usual rhythms. The shops opened, the church bell tolled, the market cafe refilled with its accustomed hum. Yet under the surface the town had changed, for gossip had gained new fuel, and respectability had suffered a bruise from which it would not soon recover. Mrs. Hopgood was taken quietly into custody, without spectacle. There were whispers, of course, and one or two faint protests of her innocence, but most citizens repeated the inspector's words as if they themselves had uncovered the truth. Already her sponge cake victory at the flower show was being recalled, with dark irony, light as air, yet heavy with guilt. Such was the town's way of making sense of scandal by folding it neatly into everyday conversation. Mr. Preece, newly absolved, walked with his moustache held higher, though he could not help resenting that for a week he had been branded guilty. He told customers he had always known the inspector would see sense, though his earlier bluster was conveniently forgotten. Clara Gedge, timid and pale, was relieved of suspicion, but remained shaken by the part her name had played. She returned to her sewing machine, grateful for obscurity, though she would forever be known as the dressmaker Soames visited. Mrs. Banbury, for her part, filled her notebook with new anecdotes and observations, proud that the flower show she so diligently ran had achieved a notoriety unmatched in the event's history. Not many towns, she declared, could boast of a corpse among the chrysanthemums. It was not a boast others cared to echo, but none denied it gave Flaxborough a curious distinction. At the police station, Sergeant Love wrestled with his own disappointment. He had been so sure of Preece, so convinced that the obvious suspect must be guilty. Yet Purbright, in his quiet way, had followed the trifles to their end. Love respected him, though he could not quite understand how he had seen what no one else had. "It was just silk and sacking," he muttered. "How can anyone hang a case on that?" Purbright, tidying his desk, replied mildly, "Because, love, silk and sacking are the very things people think are unimportant, and what people dismiss is often what betrays them." He said no more, for the lesson was best left to settle in silence. The town's attention soon drifted, as it always did, to new matters, a councillor's expense claim, a dispute over allotments, the weather's effect on dahlias. Yet beneath it all lay the knowledge that even the most respectable among them might harbour secrets strong enough to kill for. The thought lent their conversations a sharper edge, though few would admit it aloud. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk, Purbright opened the file one last time. Inside lay the note from Elm Row, the scrap of silk, a photograph of the crate. He studied them briefly, then closed the folder and marked it, concluded. There was no satisfaction in it, only the calm recognition that one more tangle of human frailty had been sorted out. As the clock ticked toward evening, he turned to the small stack of routine reports waiting on his blotter. A complaint about bicycles left against railings, a request for assistance at the church fête, a reminder about the constabulary's annual dinner. Matters of no drama, yet each with its own capacity to stir the town's passions. Purbright reached for his pen, adjusted his spectacles, and bent to his paperwork. Outside, the lamps were being lit in the high street, their glow misted by the evening air. Life went on as it always did, quietly, stubbornly, in Flaxborough. The flower show would be remembered, yes, but in time it would shrink into anecdote, absorbed into the town's endless supply of stories. Only Purbright would remember how silk and sacking, gossip and genealogy had unmasked a killer who smiled as she judged a cake. And remembering, he would continue his work, waiting patiently for the next odd detail, the next polite mask that slipped, the next quiet crime in the town that never seemed to run out of them.